Joining us now is another 2020 contender, Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan of Ohio. Congressman, welcome. John Hickenlooper is out. Many people said one of the reasons he struggled is that he was centrist and outspoken about the fact that he's centrist. You are also centrist, and you're polling at 1%. What does John Hickenlooper's departure from the race tell you about what your party's voters want?
Well, I think it opens it up. I think Biden is holding a certain ground there, but I think people are looking for someone else. And the vast majority of the party, Steph, is not way to the left. I mean, I'd say 70 to 75% of Democrats are looking for somebody who is going to talk about the economy, talk about middle class, talk about the skills gap that we have, that there are some good paying jobs out there, but we got to get people in them. Really focusing on the economic anxiety that's out there. That's what I've been doing. We've had the best 2 weeks of my campaign, money-wise, attention-wise, crowd-wise. So we're just going to keep going, and the more people get to know me, the more they're interested in helping out.
You don't have to change your game, though? I mean, seriously, you got 2 weeks left to get on the stage. It's got to be more than just there's more people, they're happier, there's more noise. You got to bring it.
Well, it's still early, too. I mean, Bill Clinton did not get into the race until October. And here it is, August, and, you know, the field's already being, in some ways, artificially winnowed by the Democratic National Committee. So, I mean, I think people on the ground are still looking. They're still interested. They want the economic message. They want someone who can win Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I'm that guy. Donald Trump does not want to run against me and talk about the economy. He's trying to distract us. He's the distractor in chief on all of these other issues. I've been the candidate focused on the economy. I will continue to focus on the economy. I've been saying the economy is not working, and we've seen it in the last couple days. And I'm going to hold his feet to the fire because he said he was going to open up the steel mills, open up the coal mines, and we've seen factories close here in my community, and he's not going to get away with that with me. And I think people want someone who's going to play offense, be aggressive, and go after him on the economy. And that's why we're getting the support we're getting now. And anybody who wants a part of this campaign that will take Trump down, it's TimRyanForAmerica.com. Show up, give us some money. Let's keep building this thing out, and let's take this guy down.
But here's what's interesting, Tim. President Trump won your state, and you said the economy is what he touted. But he's not talking about the economy very much these days. He's talking about the cultural divide, something that actually helped him win. This argument that Democrats care about them, I care about us. When you travel around the country, that economic insecurity, social insecurity, are people still hearing the president's message, and is it resonating?
It's not resonating. The shine is off the apple. When you cut taxes for the top 1%, when you make erratic decisions on trade that are completely wrecking the rural America in places like Iowa, when you're, taking care of the wealthy class, whether it's waivers for ethanol or deregulation or anything else, or trying to weaken unions.
But he argues that he doesn't care about immigrants because he cares about Americans. What are voters telling you about that sentiment?
People care about their own wallet and their own struggles. And I think if we can have a candidate that is talking to them about their economic issues, they're going to say, Trump's telling me the economy is going really well, and he's distracting us on all these issues around immigration that are fallacies. I mean, most immigrants can't get benefits, and yet he's talking like they can. And that's the reality of it. He's trying to distract. So we have to make sure we're very clear to say, one, he's full of it. Undocumented people, HB1 visa people, dreamers, they cannot get benefits. And so stop it. Let's talk about helping working class people, whether they're white, black, or brown, and being able to make it in the United States of America.
I've got to get your response to this piece of news today. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided to block two of your House colleagues, Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, from entering Israel at the request of President Trump, which separately is a weird thing that the president asked a foreign government to stop two members of Congress from getting into their country. But what's your take on this?
I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think it is President Trump getting completely unhinged because the looming recession is making him mad. And we saw it yesterday He's beating up the Fed. Now he's trying to distract on this issue with Israel. And I think the fact that Netanyahu would empower him on this is completely ridiculous. I thought it was ridiculous when Netanyahu came to speak in the United States Congress when Barack Obama had a position that he was trying to hold and yet was undermined by the Republicans in Congress when they invited him to speak. So for him to just, be a lapdog to Donald Trump, I think is completely irresponsible. Those are two members of the United States Congress. Even organizations here in the United States who are associated with Israel are saying they should be allowed in the country. And I think it's just further dividing us. The country needs to heal. But I think underneath all of this is the fact that this recession is looming and Trump is going to do everything in his power to distract the American people from the real discussions and the real decisions we need to be making here at home.
You mentioned the state of Iowa. Let's talk for a moment about Congressman Steve King, who for years has said things that many people consider offensive, inappropriate,
racist,
out of touch. But his most recent, where he suggests that humanity would not exist, there wouldn't be a population without rape or incest. What do you make of these comments?
I don't even know what to think about that, Stephanie, Ali. I mean, I don't even know. I heard that and I just thought, what in God's name is he even talking about? But this is unfortunately par for the course for Steve King. I think he should have been removed from Congress when he was making those racist remarks months ago. I was one of the ones pushing hard for that. They stripped him of his committees. He should not be a member of the United States Congress. And again, this is a distraction. We need to get back onto the focus
is this
of
about Steve King? If this is the guy he's always been and he's not backing down, is this not about, I don't know, Mitch McConnell, President Trump, or, leadership in the Republican Party to say, Steve, it's your time?
Yeah, well, I mean, team sycophants. I mean, this is what they do. Because Steve King talks very similarly as Donald Trump talking about othering people, invasions, all of these things that Trump talks about. They're very much aligned with what Steve King says. And Mitch McConnell, has lost his spine in the last few years to Donald Trump, too. So he's collapsing and folding like a cheap suit. So there's nobody here to discipline anybody. This is why as a Democrat, you actually want a strong value-based Republican Party, because it's good for the institutions of government. And here we have everyone that is part of. Yeah, there is no real debate, and there's no one who's going to smack their own member who's getting out of line. And I want to try to bring this country together, to heal this country. I'm making proposals that are actually going to be able to pass around the economy, around education, around regenerative agriculture. And we need to heal the country, get out of this left-right divide, and move into a new and better system, new and better discussions, new and better institutions. Go to TimRyanForAmerica.com. Help me out. We can do this if we can heal the country and start focusing on the issues that the American people are thinking about, not all these distractions.
Tim Ryan, what happens if you don't make the debate stage?
We're going to keep going. I mean, we've had the best 2 weeks of my campaign since we started in April. We rocked it on the soapbox in Iowa at the Iowa State Fair. Had, by almost all accounts, one of the best speeches there. One of the best speeches at the Wing Ding dinner the night before with about 2,000 people. We're picking up Joe Biden supporters in South Carolina. We have his co-chair, Representative Fletcher Smith, who was his co-chair in 2008, is now endorsed me and Brandon Brown and others down in South Carolina. We're making a move. We got 3 great endorsements in Manchester, New Hampshire. Dan O'Neill, who's the president of the Board of Aldermen there, who is the highest vote getter and has been for a long time in Manchester, New Hampshire, has endorsed us, and 2 other very popular aldermen there. We are picking up steam on the ground. And that's why I'm saying, I need a little more time, because when people hear me, they like what I have to say. They want to help. They're sending us money, and we're moving. And so I'm not going to let some artificial debate standard that doesn't play to somebody who's talking about bringing the country together and moving forward limit me. Like I said, Bill Clinton didn't get into October, so we're going to keep making a good run at this. And if we lose momentum, we lose momentum. But we got more momentum now than we ever had.
Well, good luck to you. Thanks. Hey, Tim, what was the best thing you ate at the Iowa
Thanks.
State? What's the best thing you ate at the Iowa State Fair?
Well, the root beer float, it was so hot that the root beer float, but it was actually the Busch Light draft beer that I had when it was about 100 degrees was the best thing I had.
Draft beer.
And I haven't had a Busch Light since college.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.